Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, and thank you for joining us. I'm Annie Robitaille. I am an associate professor at the University of Ottawa and hold the Commissioner Ottawa Research Chair with the Centre of Excellence in Frailty-Informed Care at Pearly Health. Today's presentation is entitled Promoting Living Well with Dementia Through Participatory Research. Following today's presentation, there will be some time for questions. You can ask your questions by writing them in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. We will do our best to get through all of your questions. We also ask that you take a minute at the end of the webinar to complete a short survey that will appear on your screen when you exit the webinar. Today's webinar will be recorded and will be made available shortly after the webinar on the Pearly Health CoE website. It is my absolute pleasure to introduce Dr. Laura Middleton. She's an associate professor and the Schlegel Research Chair in Dementia and Active Living in the Department of Kinesiology and Health Sciences at the University of Waterloo. Her research aims to identify strategies to promote health, well-being, and function of those living with or at risk for dementia. She focuses on the role of physical activity alone and in combination with healthy eating and social engagement. She takes a participatory approach by collaborating closely with people living with dementia, care partners, healthcare professionals, and community service providers to create accessible and effective programs and supports. Please welcome Dr. Laura Middleton.
Thank you so much. Just share my screen here. And thank you to everyone else for coming today over your lunch hour. I really look forward to sharing, some information about the work we've done, both our process for developing it and the rationale for it, as well as some of the toolkits that we've developed that, depending on your role and why you're here today, may be of use for you. Importantly, I talk about our work as part of participatory teams, and in this context, I am one of just many people who have contributed to this work. This isn't actually everyone. This, has some of the core people that were involved, but we have much larger teams that have been involved in the co-design along the way. These people represent many different types of interested parties, including people living with dementia and care partners, community and dementia service providers, physical activity providers, dietitians and nutrition experts, healthcare professionals, researchers. And we've tried to bring in voices from people across different geographies, rural, urban, northern communities, as well as people who identify with different ethno-racial and cultural groups, including individuals that identify as Indigenous, South Asian, East Asian, and African descent. We've also had many different organizations that have collaborated as part of this work and have helped to both develop and share our tools. So I'd just like to acknowledge their contributions as well. And of course, before I start, I'd also like to acknowledge that I'm a settler of European descent that lives and works on the traditional territory of the neutral Anishinaabe and Haudenosaunee people. I honor their stewardship of this land, and I keep in mind their traditional knowledge and ways and values as I do my work. This land that I live and work on is also part of the Halderman Tract, shown here, land on 6 miles on either side of the Grand River, granted to the Six Nations of the Grand River within the Haldeman Treaty of 1784. Of the original 950,000 acres set aside, outlined in red, less than 50,000 acres remain reserved for the Six Nations due to a series of agreements that were often entered into dishonestly and rarely adhered to in the end. Further, I would just like to acknowledge that the lands I live in and work on, as well as the lands that you live and work on, are have been home to diverse First Nations peoples. Many of these Indigenous people live and roam on vast territories across both the province and the continent. Now, when I talk about my research, I often talk about what my motivation is. And perhaps, like many of you here, I have a personal connection to dementia. My aunt, Eileen, shown here on the left, was diagnosed with early onset Alzheimer's disease at the age of 46. At the time of her diagnosis, my three young cousins were only 12, 14, and 16 years old. She was my mom's best friend, and we were very close as a family. In the early stages of her diagnosis, she walked the trail shown here, and nature remained a meaningful part of her life. Even though she continued to take community classes and keep busy early in her diagnosis, stigma of dementia kept her from disclosing her diagnosis, even to her neighbors and others close to her. I often think that these people could have supported her to live better day to day, were stigma less and inclusion more. So it's within this in mind that my research aims to improve the health, function, and well-being of people living with dementia. And over my course of my research, I've been lucky to learn from many very determined and resilient people living with dementia, just a handful of people who are pictured here. Their words, actions, experiences have each deeply influenced my thoughts, perspectives, and work in relation to dementia. But of course, I'm not the only one here or in Canada that has these personal experiences with dementia. The landmark study released by the Alzheimer's Society of Canada in the last couple of years suggests that there are about 600,000 people living with dementia today in Canada. That number is expected to more than double by 2050, largely due to aging of the population. I don't say this as a forewarning of disaster, but as an impetus to start preparations to make life better for people who live with dementia, to create communities that understand and support the well-being of people living with dementia, to create a healthcare system that doesn't just diagnose and ask people to prepare for the end, but that offers support and care and services that help people living with dementia to live to the best of their abilities. A community that understands people living with dementia as part of the richness and diversity of our society and supports participation in all ways. But what is the current status for people living with dementia? Well, often it can take years to get a diagnosis. And once they do, they're often given little support from the physician or the healthcare system. Certainly, there's exception to this and truly remarkable health systems and physicians and other healthcare professionals out there. But when we're speaking of the average experience, the person diagnosed with dementia might be put on one of 4 approved drugs for Alzheimer's disease, an acetylcholinesterase inhibitor or memantine. They will likely be told to start planning for the end of life, when they may lose function and communication. They sometimes have their driver's license taken away immediately, and at best, they may be referred to the Alzheimer's Society for care and counseling. Now, all of these are important steps, but it's not enough. It's not enough for those people living with dementia who deserve the same care, rehabilitation, and counseling as people with other conditions like cancer or heart disease. As a result, a goal of Canada's health dementia strategy is to provide a timely diagnosis with supports immediate as soon as possible after diagnosis. And I use the words of a person living with dementia here, of Roger Marple. Roger was a passionate advocate for people with dementia and for research. He passed away almost exactly 2 years ago, but his words and friendship stay with me. At a 2019 talk to a room full of people living with dementia and care partners, he said, "What if we started with hope? The learning process for dementia needs to include hope for living well and practical ways to achieve this. This should be taught first." And so in this context, we can reflect how each of us, and certainly me and my research, can take positive actions to develop better supports that support the well-being and inclusion of people living with dementia. If we can do that, their hope for living well will hopefully transform into reality. Now, what does the evidence say around what supports can actually promote the ability to live well with dementia? A study run out of the University of Exeter, whose aim was to understand the characteristics that promote living well with dementia, found this. They interviewed over 1,000 people living with dementia and care partners. From many independent research studies, they simplified their results down to 4 different actions that we can take to promote living well. Promote physical fitness and activity. Increase participation in their communities and reduce the isolation of people living with dementia. Enable people living with dementia to manage their daily activities as independently as possible and provide positive social and emotional support. Optimistically, and of course I come at this with a biased perspective, I believe that through inclusive and supportive wellness programs, we can improve all 4 elements of supporting living well. Here, I focus primarily on exercise, physical activity, healthy eating, and meal times, as that's been the focus of our research. But why focus on these elements? Well, we know that people who take up physical activity in clinical trials show improved strength, improved balance and mobility, better cognitive abilities, and improved physical fitness. Likely as a result of these changes, people living with dementia who take up physical activity show better independence in their ability to manage day-to-day activities. What I find interesting is that the care partners to these people living with dementia who get active also experience reduced stress associated with caregiving, even without becoming active themselves. Similarly, people with dementia who eat healthier, and this can be defined in a number of different ways, but adhering to the Canada Food Guide is wise. So people who eat well also experience improved energy level, enhanced mood and well-being, improved health status and immunity for encountering viruses and illness, and healthier bone and muscle mass, also resulting in improved ability to maintain daily function and independence despite dementia. Now, I like to think that it's great to support and recommend these to individuals, but community supports likely have broader benefits. When we think of supportive groups in the community, additional benefits can be experienced. In fact, when I talk to people living with dementia, they often describe the social benefits of wellness programs first. When they participate in community wellness programs, they feel socially connected to those around them. They feel supported by their peers and instructors. They develop deeper friendships and a sense of companionship. They feel part of the community. The improvements that they experience, especially as a result of physical activity programs, can improve their confidence in a way that carries over into their everyday life. And in particular, for those in whom exercise, sports, or even meal preparation was a part of their personal identity, being involved in these programs can help reinforce that sense of identity despite changes experienced with dementia. I would just like to highlight now a few of these changes in the words of people living with dementia themselves. We often underestimate the ability to live well with dementia, likely because dementia often isn't visible to the general population until it's progressed to its moderate or severe stages. Here, I'll take a few minutes to hear what the perspectives of a few people living with dementia and family members are regarding their perspective of living well with dementia.
When I was diagnosed with Alzheimer's, I kind of didn't believe it, as my mother had Alzheimer's, and she didn't handle it very well.
Well, you have to get over the fact that you got it first, because you can't just sit in a chair and sob your whole rest of your life. You know, you have to get out and do what you can do.
If one was diagnosed with dementia, whatever, you need to ask for help. To let people know what their situation is, not to hide it.
I decided my best idea was to tell people about it. And then if they saw me doing something weird, they could help me, or at least they would be aware of why I was doing it.
The advice that I would give to somebody newly diagnosed with dementia and their care partner is to find out as much as you can about dementia. There are lots of organizations that can be involved.
You're not necessarily getting better, but you're handling it. You learn how to handle it. So that's the important part, as far as I'm concerned.
I would advise anybody who is a care partner for somebody with Alzheimer's to go to a support group. It just made it so much easier for me to cope.
In an exercise program, the main thing I think would be to have someone there to help them, to assist them, to encourage them. Yes, you can do it. Yes, you can do one more.
I think exercise and eating healthy is the thing that I have to do all the time, and not let it slip.
Keeping busy. That's the one thing the doctor said to me. Get out and get busy. And other people can help you do that. Lots of people have ideas of things that you can do if you just talk to them.
I think one of the things that I want to stress, for whether it's me going down this journey with Dad, whether it be anybody else going down this journey with their family member, parent, brother, sister, whoever it may be patient. Be patient not only with the person undergoing the change, because it's scary, be patient with yourself too, right? And that's the biggest thing I think I've learned, is not to be so hard on myself. My biggest motto is always try to find that silver lining, and it won't be so bad.
That video, I'll just side mention, came about because we were doing recordings for these projects that were more focused on physical activity and healthy eating. But I just asked a question at the end about what advice they'd have for other people, not with an immediate purpose towards it, but because I was curious. And their words were so impactful to myself that we thought we absolutely have to put this into a video. Now thinking forward about supports for living well, I think most of us here can agree that the supports that for people living with dementia and care partners in the community are not where we'd like to see them. Most would agree that they're perhaps suboptimal, even compared to other healthcare conditions. So when we think about it, I'm going to frame it here in a human rights context, because despite the current existence of relatively few supports, I would argue that people living with dementia have a right to supports for their health rehabilitation, as well as their culture, recreation, and leisure opportunities. I was introduced to the UNCRPD, or the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disability, and its role in the rights of people living with dementia about 10 years ago by Mary Beth Whiten, an impactful Canadian dementia advocate. The UN CRPD supports the rights of persons with disability to full participation and inclusion in our societies. Persons with disability in this context specifically includes people living with dementia. The UN CRPD, amongst other things, supports equitable access to supports for health, habilitation, and participation in cultural life, recreation, leisure, and sport. I believe all of these aspects are directly relevant to physical activity, healthy eating, and mealtime programs and services. Measures to support health and function should begin as early as possible, be provided in the right location for each person, which usually means close to where they live. To achieve this, it's important to train professionals and staff and equip them with the tools necessary to support these measures to occur. Now, currently, we know that people don't have access or equitable access to healthcare and function, thinking broadly in the healthcare system as well as in the community. They face multiple barriers to participation that can be understood within a social ecological model, shown here. The social ecological model recognizes that accessibility and participation is determined not only by the individual's abilities, but also by interpersonal relationships, as well as their relationships with institutions, the community, and policy. The ability of people living with dementia to participate is not only determined by their own abilities and impairments, but by how their abilities are supported by family and friends and others in their community. Whether they have access to programs and services that meet their needs and preferences, whether people living in their community hold stigma of dementia, or whether they understand dementia and are able to meet the needs of people living with dementia. This includes both general community members as well as healthcare professional and community service providers. And so when we came to the start of the DICE and the DREAM project, we, after interviewing and doing focus groups amongst community service providers and healthcare providers around the opportunities for wellness programs and services for people with dementia, it became clear that there were insufficient health and wellness supports to meet the diverse needs and preferences of people living with dementia. That a single either rehabilitation, exercise, or mealtime program wasn't enough to meet the diverse needs of people living with dementia. When we think about those who are younger versus older, earlier stage versus later stage, let alone the diverse preferences that people might have in relation to wellness programming. And so our goal or our vision became a greater number, quality, and variety of health and wellness programs and services available to people living with dementia in Canadian communities, so that they could experience the physical, mental, and social benefits of these wellness programs. Now, when we considered how best to accomplish this vision, we thought that the most effective and feasible way was to bring together all those partners that were necessary to participate in order to influence the available supports in the community. And we thought the best way to expand the number of supports was actually to train program and service providers so that they understood dementia and had the capacity and skills and knowledge so that they could meet the needs of people living with dementia in their programs and services. What we heard from the people we interviewed was that they were willing to accommodate, and many were actually keen to do so, but they had no formalized education or training in most cases to actually meet the needs of people with dementia. So they were having to do that on an ad hoc basis. We believe that people who understood dementia and had supportive strategies could plan programs so that they better met the needs of people living with dementia, and they would have the strategies needed to accommodate the unique needs of individuals living with dementia who are participants in their programs and services. Our goal was to use a participatory approach in these projects, working in true collaboration in all levels of the project, from the project conception through to knowledge translation. These projects were actually my very first journey through participatory research, which was a bit intimidating at first. I think my own hesitation early in the journey probably slowed the process. However, this hesitation that I had also came with strengths. We took the time to learn and maneuver the process. We truly had time to develop deep relationships and develop shared perspectives and a common vision for our projects and goals. So I'll describe in brief how we captured these participatory teams across both the DICE and the DREAM project, where I mostly focus on today. So when we brought together the DICE team, we first brought together the research team, what we often use different names here, but the research team indeed included all those participant types that I talked with first: people living with dementia and care partners, representatives of the Alzheimer's Society and other community organizations that sought to provide services directly to people living with dementia. We had exercise providers, because the focus of this DICE project, which was the first phase, was specifically on exercise and broadening exercise opportunities for people living with dementia. We went through the phases. We collected research to understand the barriers and had mapped to our end goal of training community service providers. So towards that purpose, we then brought together a co-design workshop. So these involved additional people living with dementia and care partners and other community partners in an intensive one-day workshop. In this workshop, we reviewed the draft from the team, the draft resources, evolved them. We, in fact, did not develop what we started with, and then built plans for each of these resources, selecting content and how it would be packaged, as well as how we would share it. When it came to the DREAM project, which is related to DICE, it was really an expansion of the DICE project. We had a toolkit from DICE that was a result of this participatory process. And when we moved to DREAM, we wanted to extend that in a couple ways. The first was by expanding scope. We started with exercise in the DICE toolkit, and here we wanted to add content related to healthy eating and meal times to treat wellness programming in a more holistic way. We also wanted to make the exercise-related content relevant to more diverse settings. So thinking more about physical activity that might be inclusive of dance, of hikes, of walking, of gardening, rather than just focused exercise on improving fitness. Importantly, we also recognized that people accessed wellness supports and services in diverse settings, especially if they were people who identified with ethnic, racial, and linguistic minority groups. In these cases, people might access wellness services in cultural community centers or in places of worship, rather than accessing places like community fitness centers or the Alzheimer's Society. And so when we were moving from DICE towards DREAM, we expanded our team. So we already had a fairly large participatory team. Most of those people stayed on as we moved into the DREAM project, but we also engaged new members. Of course, for the healthy eating content, we engaged dietitians and nutrition experts. But importantly, because we wanted to take a purposeful effort to make these resources relevant to diverse ethno-racial groups and geographic regions, we also engage more people from diverse ethno-racial communities and identities. In this DREAM project, the research team, again, we had a research team that oversaw the development and drafting of resources. And then we had a larger co-design team that reflected on these draft materials that were now the DREAM toolkit and provided rounds of feedback. Importantly, we functioned a little bit differently in DREAM than in DICE, partly because this occurred in 2020 and in 2021. So we couldn't engage in the same way. It was impossible to bring people together in person. While the research team started in late 2020, the co-design was actually in the summer of 2021. And I don't know about all your experiences, but our community service providers and healthcare service providers, healthcare professionals, I think at this time were often overworked, and we're going back and forth handling different waves of the pandemic. Services would return to in person and go back online. And so they were handling these ever changing restrictions. And so the co-design in this case actually happened through a series of mailouts of the draft resources. Most individuals provided feedback by email or comments on the documents, while some people, such as people living with dementia, met with our research team members one-on-one. There's, of course, different perspectives across, so we worked within our research team that met regularly on Zoom to try to reconcile the differences we were hearing across groups. Importantly, I want to recognize that our aim was to create tools that were perceived as relevant to all and inclusive. I've reflected on this often and whether this is actually achievable. Indeed, in one dementia network that I'm a part of, I asked a panelist who worked, a panel of people who worked on projects that focused on either Indigenous community or LGBTQ plus groups. And they said, indeed, that no, you can't have one solution, at least that's ideal for all. And so I would say our aim became something that felt relevant to all, even if we knew that the ideal might be adaptive. So what we did do to accommodate these needs was represent different ways of being active and eating well in images, videos, and case studies with people of diverse backgrounds. I don't think we achieved the ideal. It's difficult finding to find that balance, but we certainly progressed it. And I think our team members of diverse backgrounds were quite pleased with what we came up with. One point I'll say in relation to dementia is that both in this project and other places through the Go design process, we found that preferred language for dementia varies greatly across individuals, groups, and cultures. Certainly in Canada, we see differences in the Anglophone versus Francophone communities as well. In some cultures, the word for dementia is highly stigmatized and insulting, as some would perceive dementia to be. Others, such as in Quebec, that they use very biomedical terminology. We were not able to find the perfect terminology, but we did recognize this language in our tools and in our learning modules that people have different ways of viewing dementia, whether it's part of the circle of life or biomedical, and that different terms were used. And so the end result of these two co-design process were the DICE and the DREAM toolkits. They were initially developed in two related but distinct websites. More recently, we've merged these two separate websites to have a broader website focus on dementia wellness with diverse learning modules, videos, and resources. You can see that here. So in the last little bit of this webinar, I'll focus on what you can find here and how it may be of use to you or your practice or perhaps students that you work with. So the Dementia Wellness website hosts both the DICE and DREAM toolkits on one single easy to find website. The website address is www.dementiawellness.com. The makeup of the toolkits is similar, but the DICE toolkit has a distinct focus on exercise and is suitable for exercise specialists, including clinical exercise physiologists, registered kinesiologists, physiotherapists, versus the DREAM toolkit is really meant to be quite broad, serving the needs of both staff and volunteers, perhaps care partners that support physical activity, healthy eating, and mealtimes in diverse settings. All the learning modules are free and easily accessible online. Completion is recognized by a certificate, which can potentially be shared on resumes or with current and potential employers. We have two different sections in the website. One you can see here for people living with dementia, and the one I'll focus on first is for service providers. Depending on the group that individuals identify with, they can go down to this section on exercise providers or community service providers. In this section, they'll find links to both learning modules as well as relevant resources. When we think about the learning modules specifically, you can see the topics that are here. I would say that this first area is an overarching introduction that will help you understand dementia, different types of dementia, and changes that may occur with dementia, as well as the rights of people living with dementia and general inclusive strategies. I would argue that this section broadly is relevant to almost anyone in the community that's looking to know more about dementia and support people living with dementia in their lives. The other two modules or sections focus on the benefits and recommendations directly related to exercise or physical activity, and then healthy eating or meal times. These have information about the benefits and recommendations, as well as dementia inclusive practices that are specific to those settings. You can see here that each lesson, which is how it's framed on our website, has a number of different parts. It probably looks quite small to you, but you can see the different segments of the lesson listed down here. Within lessons, there's text, there's case studies, there's videos, as well as review questions. So at the end of each module, you can see at the very end, there's review questions that you need to pass in order to progress to the next section. So here's just an example of questions that might appear. The resources you can access either within the section, the subsection of service providers, or by clicking directly through to the resources on the top right of the screen. The resources include a variety of resources, both internal resources and extensions that are related to dementia, exercise, physical activity, healthy eating, and meal times. Importantly, all of the website is available in both English and French, including both resources and learning modules. And the key resources developed through the DREAM Toolkit are additionally available in simplified Chinese, Punjabi, Portuguese, and Arabic. Here I share just a couple of our resources that appear on the website. So this is one of the healthy eating supports, but our Chinese resource. And this is one that we worked with to revamp with the Ontario Brain Institute. Some of you will know that a number of years ago, they came up with physical activity guidelines, both for risk reduction of dementia as well as promoting well-being. What we found is that the formatting was not actually that accessible for people living with dementia to use. So we worked closely with them to just revamp the formatting and the wording so that it was more useful to families and people living with dementia. I would argue that the most impactful part of the toolkits, which are also integrated into the learning modules, are the videos. So I showed you one right at the beginning around living well with dementia. And that was really our added one. But we have an additional 5 videos that are part of the DREAM and DICE toolkits. So we have one that says, I have dementia, but I'm still me. And this is meant to capture the diversity of dementia, to recognize that dementia is not one condition that looks the same across people. We have videos on exercise. Staying active helps me live well with dementia, and dementia inclusive physical activity. A little support goes a long way. And then 2 that are focused on healthy eating and meal times. Healthy eating helps me live well with dementia, and eating together brings me joy with dementia. So I'll just show a short portion of another video, just a couple minutes It's kind of half of the entire video, but one on staying active helps me live well with dementia.
And I didn't think I could, use most of the equipment because I've never been an exercise person other than for walking, but I love it.
Some of the benefits that people living with dementia experience with exercise would be improved mood, improved independence, just the ability to feel better day to day.
I feel more energetic and I think I sleep better, and I just, exercise is totally doing me good, 100%.
I had a lady who used a walker every day after our exercise program. She does not bring that walker with her anywhere. She doesn't need it in the house. She walks independently, and I can only imagine how much independence that has given her.
And when you feel more confident, I think, just in exercise, I feel like that translates outside of the building as well. So hopefully they feel more confident in some other skills, maybe conversing with people, because it is in an environment where you need to connect with others. And then there's a group class, so there's other participants and other caregivers. So that's a really important aspect of that benefit, that they feel, I think, positive about their physical ability, but then also their ability to still interact with people around them.
So it's sort of like, oh gee, life isn't going to be as bad as I thought.
You're muted.
Thank you. I was just saying that I love that last bit by Al, because when I first met him with dementia, he really talked about the difficulty getting out of the house and being engaged in the community. He felt a lot of loss and, kind of maybe a little apathetic, we might describe. And the Golf for Life program that he was involved with there really changed his life, living with dementia, and developed this community and people who encouraged him, and an activity where he felt improvement. But let me go on and get through our last few minutes. The Dream and DICE websites also have these sections for people living with dementia directly. They cover the same topics as our inner learning modules, but in a more accessible way, so that under each segment, we have text that relates to the content in simple to read language. We have a relevant video as well as a handout that they can use further. In addition to the core resources that I just talked about here, I will touch on that there are other resources, including teaching slides available upon request. There's high quality resources from other organizations related to our core topics. And also the Delight program has the program guide and resources there. I'm not talking about it now, but that's another program specifically aiming for people in early stage dementia to promote, as Roger said, hope and strategies for living well. So I'm happy to talk about that more for anyone who might be interested in developing a program. But we did do a brief evaluation that I'll discuss in brief. So we had, this was again during the pandemic, but we had 33 service providers who did assessments before and after reviewing the DREAM resources, as well as a few months later, to try to understand the impact both on their knowledge, attitudes, and practices related with dementia. You can see there was a variety of people. Most were women, had quite a range of ages, and with a variety of experience in relation to dementia, whether it's no experience, some personal or professional, or both. I'd say our education was probably a little bit more than we hoped in terms of already having experience delivering with doing programs with dementia, but certainly we're glad that we had these participants as well. In very brief, these show some of the results. So you can see there was an improvement in knowledge in relation to dementia and risk factors, improved confidence or self-efficacy for providing services to people living with dementia, and improved attitudes towards dementia. using the Dementia Attitude Scale. Their knowledge in relation to physical activity and dementia increased, although the knowledge related to nutrition didn't quite make kind of what we might call statistical significance in this small sample. I think likely it's the words that are most prominent here. So I share a couple quotes around kind of the usefulness that people see in the future. So one said, "I will definitely use the resources and modules provided by DICE for future reference." One prime example in which this can be used is whenever I receive students for placements, I feel as though if they were to complete the DICE modules, it will help give them a better sense of not only what it's like to live with dementia, but also the relationship between exercise and dementia and how to implement exercise for those living with dementia. Another participant said, "Well, it was very informational, very educational, and I like that. Like every module was something new for me to learn. I think the videos were really well done. I think that gave me more insight into what it was really like." And I really do think that it was the videos that we heard again and again were particularly impactful because we heard from the voices of people living with dementia and their families. Optimistically, this has already been adopted by a number of organizations in Canada as well as internationally to support the ongoing education of people who might be living with dementia. And so I'll just finish off with a few take-home points. I would argue that people living with dementia have a right to equitable support for their health and well-being and inclusion in their communities, and that physical activity, nutrition, and mealtimes can be an important part of that. A deep participatory process where we work closely with people living with dementia and care partners, as well as healthcare professionals and community providers, can create relevant and impactful resources. And I just highlight, if you're interested in learning more or accessing these resources, again, they're all freely available online at www.dementiawellness.com. With that, I'd just like to thank some of our key funders, the Canada Brain Research Fund and Alzheimer's Society of Canada, as well as the Public Health Agency of Canada and the Canadian Institutes of Health Research. So thank you very much. And I'd like to close out there, but welcome questions or discussion, comments. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you for such an insightful presentation, and thanks for sharing your expertise. I loved the video, and I can totally see how all the resources that you talked about will be so beneficial to the students that that volunteer or work or live with someone living with dementia. And particularly for me, obviously the entourage program, the students that are matched or that are companions to people living with dementia, I think these resources will be amazing for them. So thanks again for such an amazing presentation. And I think we can now open the floor for questions. And I think we already have one. Would this be applicable to someone who is caring for a family member?
So thank you so much, Dale. I think absolutely. We've certainly have care partners that did all the learning modules. So that's one way to go through it. These, you could easily maneuver, and I think they would give you supports. We thought a lot about how family members can support people living with dementia, especially in exercise when everyone was at home during the pandemic. We don't want to put it all through on you, certainly, because often as a care partner, there's so much going on, but they are relevant there. And I think, to be honest, when we're sharing resources from the DREAM, the basic resource around understanding dementia is one that families often go towards, because you're given so little information often when you get a diagnosis. If you don't fully want to go through the learning modules, the sections that we geared for people living with dementia, I think, are also relevant for care partners as well, and certainly the resources that we share there. So have a look and see what you think is relevant to you.
Do we have it? Oh, yes, one more. Oh, it's a thank you. wait a few seconds, and if not, well, while we wait for more questions, I might ask, what role do you think like students could play in promoting engagement in physical activity for people living with dementia?
I think engaging students is incredibly impactful. We have, and you saw some pictures in the videos, there's younger people living with or working with people living with dementia. That's a program that we have at the university that's in our fitness center. We have the Delight program we've run at our site too with students. And I think it's incredibly impactful both ways. One, that they have some basic knowledge and can gain it through this and experience. And I think, the value of those intergenerational relationships separately. So there's the expertise they have, but also the meaning of that relationship, I think is really important. I think their ability to help people, but also then the ability of people living with dementia to provide some mentorship and share their life experience is so important. We have these programs, but I honestly think that, just that engagement between students and the participants is half of the benefit, because it's so impactful. And I think that, starting people early in their careers with an understanding of dementia and true lived experience is incredibly valuable, no matter what they go on to do.
Yeah, I agree with that comment. I feel like it should be part of the curriculum, like for anyone, and it's not only in health sciences, it's in any faculty. I feel like students would definitely benefit from that kind of knowledge.
Yeah, I think we're thinking more and more even younger too. I talked to a few people with dementia who are really passionate about the support that they've gotten from their grandchildren and whatnot, that are 9, 10, 11, 12. So I think the earlier we can introduce some of this understanding of dementia, the less likely stigma will develop. Right? That's not this inherent concept that's out there. That's just because of what they're exposed to and language around it. So if we can start earlier, then we'll probably have more impact.
Absolutely. We have another question. So Dan says, thank you for your insightful presentation. I appreciate your dedication to improving the quality of life for individuals living with dementia. Could you share a few recommendations for starting a safe and effective physical activity journey? Perhaps you could remind them that not all personal trainers are equal and that they need to stay safe while they're active.
Yeah, I think, thank you so much for the question, Dan. I think, there's a bunch of aspects that I'll try to touch on quickly here. I think that more and more physicians are starting to recommend exercise to people who've gotten a diagnosis, but it's often just that you should exercise. And often that's challenging to do without supports. So especially I think if you're new to exercise, going to someone who provides high quality training, whether that's a physiotherapist, if you have some injuries to overcome, in Ontario, a registered kinesiologist, a clinical exercise physiologist are all good options. I would say that reputable fitness centers, locally, we work a lot with the YMCA because they have a mission towards inclusion and have really great wellness services, and training is a good place to start. I don't want to restrict to just that, of course, but you do want someone who can understand kind of your needs and abilities and challenges. And that's both physical as well as just how best to support communication and safety. Depending on the person with dementia, they may have a harder time, monitoring their own challenge and safety. And so just keeping in mind the individual's ability will be important. Sometimes it's safe and supportive to have a family member, and sometimes you need more support depending on where you're at. I know that one, a simple activity that is at least a starting point for a physical activity journey is often as simple as walking, right? That often walking outside with friends or family or even pets is like a personally meaningful activity for a lot of people. So it brings joy in different ways as well to someone who might, as an initial step, be intimidated to go to a gym, but is a great first step. And we have, you know, winter being the challenge in Canada, you know, there's ways to support that either by going indoors, and we have neat examples of people choosing different paths or wearing spikes on their shoes for people who this remains really meaningful for. I do, as one more step, not to talk too much on this question, but you know, certainly doing strength training as well is really beneficial for maintaining that independence, especially for all of us. And I think of this myself as we age, you know, maintaining strength will help you to maintain all those activities of daily living as long as possible, whether it's in the context of dementia or not. That may require sometimes a little bit more training or supervision, but we can do really simple exercises like squats, or if you're not familiar with that term, just chair stands, right? Standing up from a chair on a regular basis uses a lot of muscles in your lower body. Doing push-ups either against the wall or against a table, if you can't do them on the floor, is again a great upper body exercise. So there are these exercises that are core to your function that are relatively accessible.
Do we have any more questions? No? I think if not, the webinar is we're coming to the end of the hour, and so I want to say thanks again, Dr. Middleton, for this amazing presentation, and thanks to everyone for attending the webinar. Also, I'd like to mention to please join us for our next webinar series scheduled for November 26th at noon by Dr. Raquel Bettini and Lumila Husak from the Canadian Institute for Health Information. They'll be presenting some of their work on understanding healthcare trajectories of people living with dementia. So thanks again.
Please, if anyone does have more questions, feel free to reach out to me by email or otherwise.